Welcome, dear listener. You've found your way once again to the Sleepy Historian, where the hours grow long, the voices stay soft, and history itself becomes your companion through the quiet stretches of the night. This is, as always, boring history for sleep, a place where stories from the ancient past are told in a way that helps the body unwind, the mind slow, and the eyes grow heavy. If you enjoy falling asleep to boring history, if the gentle rhythm of bedtime relaxation and soft storytelling helps ease you into rest, then you are in the right place. Some call it a soft-spoken history documentary. Others think of it as calm bedtime storytelling. But however you experience it, I hope this small corner of history brings you peace. If this kind of storytelling helps you rest, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it truly offers you comfort. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from, and perhaps what time it is for you. There's something quietly reassuring about knowing others are out there, scattered across time zones and continents, drifting into the same stillness, listening to the same quiet words. So, wherever you are, dim the lights if you can. Let your surroundings soften, as if even the air itself were hushed. Take a slow breath in and a slower one out. Relaxing history to fall asleep to is not about excitement or urgency. It's about moving gently, almost imperceptibly, through stories of the past until the present moment itself becomes softer and more distant. Tonight, we journey to the banks of the Nile, to a world where the river was not simply a body of water, but the very breath of civilization. To Egypt, the land of endless sands, monumental stone, and gods who lived among the people through temples, symbols, and rituals that spanned thousands of years. The theme of this night's tale is jaw-dropping secrets of the pharaohs nobody talks about. Though pharaohs are often remembered for golden tombs, pyramids, and powerful armies, there were stranger, quieter, and more curious corners of their world that slip beneath the notice of most stories. This exploration will unfold in 4 steady parts. First, we'll slip into the daily life of ancient Egypt, walking among farmers, scribes, and workers who sustained the great kingdom. Then, we'll wander into the life of a singular figure, a pharaoh whose story reveals as much in its subtleties as in its grandeur. After that, we will explore a touch of mystery, archaeology, and cultural enigma, secrets hidden beneath the sands, questions left unanswered by time. Finally, we'll look at the contrast of lives, the world of elites and royals, compared with the humble rhythms of ordinary people. 2 realities that coexisted yet felt worlds apart. Each segment will carry you further into that ancient landscape, yet always at a pace that never demands wakefulness. As we move gently from one moment to the next, may you find yourself soothed, relaxed, and if sleep comes along the way, that is as it should be. So let the sands whisper, let the Nile drift quietly through the darkness, and let us begin. Imagine yourself on the banks of the Nile, thousands of years ago. The sun is just beginning its slow climb above the horizon, and the light it casts is muted, pale, almost hazy in the thin desert air. Before the brightness of day sharpens the edges of the world, the villages of ancient Egypt stir awake in quiet, deliberate rhythms. Daily life here was marked not by the clock, as we know it today, but by the movement of the river, the cycle of seasons, and the demands of the land. For most Egyptians, life began with the first hint of dawn. Farmers would rise from their simple mud brick homes, roofs sometimes open to the sky, and step out onto cool earth still holding the night's chill. The Nile was the axis of all existence. Its waters rose and fell with predictable patience, bringing floods that covered the fields with dark, fertile silt. This annual rhythm meant survival, and it shaped everything: when to plant, when to harvest, when to store food for leaner times. Villagers worked with simple wooden plows pulled by oxen, sowing barley and emmer wheat, staples of the Egyptian diet. If you listen closely in your imagination, you might hear the scrape of wood against soil, the low calls of animals, and the rustling of reeds swaying along the water's edge. Food was humble but sustaining. Bread, coarse and filling, and beer, thick and nourishing, were consumed daily by nearly all. Vegetables like onions, garlic, and leeks added flavor and strength, while dates and figs offered sweetness and moderation. Meat was less common for ordinary people, reserved mostly for festivals or shared community events. Life was steady, predictable, and at times monotonous, but it carried a kind of comfort in its repetition. The homes of common Egyptians were modest, often built of sun-dried mud bricks stacked in simple squares or rectangles. Inside, the air was cool and shadowed, with little more than woven mats, clay pots, and reed baskets for possessions. The walls were often plain, though sometimes decorated with painted designs of lotus flowers or geometric shapes. At night, families slept close together on mats or low platforms, sometimes with livestock nearby, blurring the lines between human and animal space in the close-knit villages. Children ran barefoot, their laughter echoing between the houses as they played with toys carved from wood, balls made of cloth, or small figurines shaped from clay. They imitated their parents' work, helping to fetch water, carry baskets, or weave simple mats. Education, in the formal sense, was reserved for a very small number of children destined to become scribes or priests, but all learned the skills they needed by simply living the daily rhythm of their families. Scribes, though fewer in number, played an essential role. They carried with them the knowledge of reading and writing, of measuring and accounting, of recording harvests and temple offerings. To become a scribe was to step into a life of privilege compared to farming, but also one of endless repetition. Imagine sitting for hours, bent over papyrus, copying symbols that must be precise, steady, and correct. Ink made from soot and ochre stained the fingers, and the reed pens wore down quickly under constant use. Yet, with each mark, the affairs of the kingdom were given permanence. Religion was never far away, woven seamlessly into daily life. Small household shrines held figurines of protective gods and goddesses. Bes, the dwarf-like figure who guarded families, or Tarit, the hippopotamus goddess who watched over childbirth. Farmers might whisper prayers to Hapi, the god of the Nile's flood, hoping the waters would rise just enough to nourish the fields, but not so much as to destroy homes. Life was uncertain, yet people found reassurance in rituals that gave order to a world that often felt fragile. The sounds of daily Egyptian life were steady and unhurried. The clatter of grinding stones as women prepared flour. The rhythm of weaving looms, threads stretched and tightened by hand. The calls of traders moving along dirt paths, balancing baskets filled with onions, fish, or woven goods. Even the silence of the desert itself felt like part of the rhythm, stretching endlessly beyond the villages, a constant reminder of the narrow band of fertile land that clung to the Nile's edge. And always there was the river. In the early morning, boats carved from papyrus or wood glided across the water. Fishermen cast their nets, while others ferried goods, clay jars, baskets of grain, bundles of flax. The Nile was the great connector, carrying people and products between towns and temples, weaving the many threads of Egyptian life into a single continuous fabric. The rhythm of life was neither glamorous nor simple. It was work, constant, demanding, repetitive, but within it lay the quiet stability that allowed great monuments to be built, temples to rise, and pharaohs to rule. The pyramids and statues that still stand were only possible because of countless unseen hands grinding grain, shaping mud bricks, and tending fields under the watchful eye of the river and the gods. As you picture this scene, mud brick houses with their small courtyards, smoke rising faintly from hearth fires, the Nile glinting in morning light, you can almost feel the calmness of their world, a world that moved in harmony with nature's rhythm, where the passing of time was marked by sunrise, sunset, and the eternal flow of the river. This was the foundation upon which all else in Egypt was built. And as we continue, we will remain with these people, exploring more of their lives, their work, their faith, and their quiet, steady routines that gave strength to one of history's greatest civilizations. As the sun climbed higher in the Egyptian sky, the land brightened into sharper colors. The soft tones of dawn gave way to the golden hues of day, and the villages spread across the riverbanks, stirred with the quiet industry of work. Where the first hours of morning were given to tending fields and animals, the later parts of the day unfolded into the varied crafts and trades that sustained the kingdom. Imagine walking through one of these small settlements, the air thick with warmth but also alive with steady, rhythmic sounds. A hammer tapping on copper, the rasp of stone being ground smooth, the faint clatter of weaving looms. Ancient Egypt was not only an agricultural society. It was a land of artisans, builders, and traders, each contributing to the great mosaic of daily life. Craftsmen were highly valued. In shaded workshops, carpenters shaped wood into stools, chests, and simple tools. Their materials were often imported: cedar from Lebanon, ebony from the south, since native Egypt had limited trees. Working by hand with bronze or copper chisels, they created pieces that ranged from humble household items to elaborate furniture for temples and palaces. The rhythm of their work was patient and methodical, the kind of slow repetition that defined the labor of centuries. Nearby, potters turned clay on simple wheels, forming jars that would hold beer, oil, and grain. The smell of damp clay mixed with smoke from the kilns as vessels were hardened by fire. The jars were not merely functional. Many were painted with simple red or black designs, adding quiet beauty to everyday life. The pottery shards that survive in abundance today are not relics of grandeur, but of repetition. Millions of small acts of shaping and firing, day after day. Weavers worked with flax, transforming the stalks of the plant into linen, Egypt's most common textile. Imagine their hands moving in smooth rhythm, twisting fibers in a thread, stretching them across wooden looms. Linen varied from coarse and heavy, suitable for laborers' tunics, to delicate and nearly translucent fabrics prized by the wealthy. The act of weaving, like so many daily tasks, was repetitive and soothing in its constancy, connecting each generation to the one before. The clothing of ordinary Egyptians was simple. Men often wore kilts or short skirts of linen, while women dressed in long, sheath-like garments, sometimes with straps over the shoulders. Children, especially in the heat of summer, might wear little at all. Sandals were made of woven reeds or leather, though many went barefoot as they worked the fields or moved through the dust of the village paths. Jewelry, beads, amulets, and carved stones was worn by rich and poor alike, not only for decoration but for protection, carrying prayers for health, fertility, and long life. Food preparation filled much of the day as well. The grinding of grain into flour was a ceaseless task, performed with heavy stones that wore grooves into their surfaces over years of use. Women baked flat loaves in clay ovens, while men brewed beer in large vats, the air carrying a yeasty, earthy scent. Markets, often located near temples or central courtyards, bustled with trade. Fish from an aisle, vegetables from nearby plots, baskets of fruit, and jars of beer passed from hand to hand, exchanged not always for coin but for goods and services. Seasons dictated everything. Inundation, the annual flooding of the Nile, was a time of waiting as the river spread across the land, depositing fertile silt. Planting followed, with entire communities working side by side to sow crops. Harvest came months later, celebrated with quiet relief. These rhythms gave life a kind of predictability that made the world feel ordered, even in the face of uncertainty. Each season carried its own sounds, smells, and sights. The roar of waters rising in summer, the dry crackle of harvested fields in autumn, the rustling of new shoots in spring. Religion wove itself into these cycles. Temples were not distant monuments, but living centers of community life. Priests offered daily rituals to the gods, but ordinary people also brought offerings, bread, flowers, small figurines, to seek favor or protection. Festivals punctuated the year with moments of joy, music, and procession, when the divine was believed to move among the people. Imagine the slow march of priests carrying statues of gods on their shoulders, drums and flutes sounding softly, while villagers watched with reverence. Even entertainment had its place. Board games like Senet, played on wooden boards with small tokens, offered leisure in quiet evenings. Music filled the air at gatherings, harps, flutes, and hand drums setting rhythms for simple songs. Stories were told aloud, myths of gods and kings that reminded listeners of the balance between order and chaos. In these simple diversions, there was respite from the labor of daily survival. The desert framed everything. Beyond a narrow strip of fertile land, the sand stretched endlessly, silent and still. For Egyptians, this vastness was both protection and mystery. It shielded their civilization from many invaders, but also held secrets, tombs, and the eternal resting places of the dead. To live in Egypt was to live between two worlds, the lush banks of the Nile and the infinite expanse of the desert. Through all of this, the pace of life remained unhurried. Tasks took the time they needed. Journeys by boat moved with the current. The heat of midday forced rest, and the cool of evening invited calm conversation under starlight. The rhythm of life was slow, almost meditative, shaped less by urgency than by the natural world's steady flow. When we think of ancient Egypt, we often picture colossal temples and stone pyramids. Yet, the true strength of the civilization lay here, in the steady persistence of farmers, craftsmen, and families whose lives rarely made the scrolls of history. Their daily work, simple and repeated, provided the foundation upon which kings and dynasties could rise. Without them, the monuments would never have been built, the gods never so richly honored, and the stories never told. So as you picture these scenes, artisans in their shaded workshops, women grinding grain in courtyards, children playing beside the Nile, allow yourself to feel the steady rhythm of their days. Life was not easy, but it was enduring, flowing like the river itself, constant, patient, eternal. As the day moved toward its later hours, the sun's intensity pressed down on the land. In ancient Egypt, midday was not the time for ambition or endless labor. Instead, it was a time when work slowed, when shade was sought, and when families gathered in the cooler corners of their homes. To understand daily life here is not only to see the labor of fields and workshops, but also to glimpse the quiet domestic spaces, the rituals of rest, and the unspoken rhythms that shaped existence. Homes of ordinary Egyptians were compact, built of mud brick baked hard by the sun. From a distance, the villages seemed like clusters of square boxes, their flat roofs sometimes used as sleeping platforms on warm nights. Inside, rooms were small, with few furnishings. Clay jars stored grain, woven baskets held dates or dried fish, and mats provided the simplest of seating. The coolness inside was welcome, even if the air carried a faint mustiness of enclosed space. Life unfolded in these interiors with quiet intimacy. Families ate together from shared dishes, dipping bread into stews flavored with onions, herbs, or lentils. Meals were not extravagant, but they were sustaining. At times, neighbors shared food or gathered in communal spaces, reinforcing bonds of kinship and trust. In a world where survival often depended on cooperation, the household was not isolated but part of a wider fabric of community. Children grew into these rhythms naturally. They learned through imitation, boys trailing their fathers into fields or workshops, girls at their mothers' sides in kitchens or weaving spaces. There were lullabies sung softly at night, and moments of play with carved toys or games of throwing sticks. These small diversions, though fleeting, balanced the seriousness of survival. Childhood passed quickly, and by adolescence, most were already integrated into the adult roles that would define their lives. Work was divided, but not strictly rigid. Men often labored in agriculture, construction, or trade, while women oversaw food, weaving, and the household economy. Yet, women in Egypt had rights unusual for much of the ancient world. They could own property, sign contracts, and inherit wealth. Those social roles were distinct. The recognition of women as legal individuals set Egyptian life apart in subtle but important ways. Medicine was both practical and spiritual. Simple remedies were prepared from herbs, honey, and oils. Garlic was believed to strengthen the body, while honey was used to treat wounds. Physicians recorded observations on papyrus scrolls, offering prescriptions that mixed pragmatic care with invocations to the gods. Illness was often seen as both physical and divine, and healing combined the application of balms with prayers whispered over the patient. Imagine the scene: a family gathered quietly around a loved one, a healer murmuring incantations, the air heavy with the scent of crushed herbs. Religion, too, was woven into the most private spaces of life. Small household shrines were common, often tucked into corners with simple clay figures. A woman might leave offerings for Tarit, the goddess who protected mothers and children. A farmer might place a small figure of Happy on a shelf, hoping for generous floods. These shrines were humble, but they created a sense of connection between the vastness of the divine and the intimacy of the home. Death was never far from thought, yet it was not approached with fear alone. Egyptians believed in the afterlife as a continuation of existence, one that required preparation but also offered hope. Funerary practices, even for ordinary people, included careful burial in the desert sands, accompanied by amulets or small items for use beyond this world. For the wealthy, tombs and elaborate rituals reflected greater resources, but for all, there was a sense that life did not end. It shifted, moving into another realm. The passage of time was not measured in hours and minutes, but in the slow cycles of nature. The rising and setting of the sun marked the day. The flood of the Nile marked the year. The constellations that stretched across the night sky were guides for both farmers and priests. Life moved in circles, and within those circles, individuals found meaning. There was comfort in this repetition, a reassurance that even as generations passed, the rhythms remained unchanged. Festivals punctuated this flow with moments of shared joy. Imagine torchlight processions, boats decorated with flowers drifting along the river, music rising into the evening air. These events were not only religious, but communal, strengthening the bonds that tied people to each other and to the world beyond themselves. For many, these were the rare occasions when life expanded beyond the daily tasks, when the divine felt near, and when the village seemed part of something greater. The Nile remained the constant backdrop. Its waters carried goods, its floods nourished fields, its fish provided sustenance. To sit by its banks at evening was to see reflections of palm trees ripple in gold and violet hues, to hear the quiet lap of water against boats tied to shore. Children might play nearby, fishermen might mend their nets, and elders might sit in calm conversation, recounting stories of years past. The river was not only a source of life, but also of peace, a place where the endless cycles of work and rest could be contemplated in stillness. Daily life in ancient Egypt was not extraordinary in the sense of grand events or dramatic change. It was extraordinary in its endurance. For thousands of years, generation after generation lived in this narrow band of land between river and desert, repeating tasks, telling stories, offering prayers, and building lives that, while humble, formed the foundation of one of history's most enduring civilizations. So as you let this scene settle in your imagination, small houses clustered close together, children laughing in dusty streets, women weaving linen in shaded courtyards, men returning from fields as the sun set. Remember the calm constancy of their world, a constancy so steady that even now, across millennia, we can almost step into it, if only in the stillness of our thoughts. This completes our immersion into the daily lives of ordinary Egyptians. From their fields to their homes, from their work to their rituals, we see how life flowed like the Nile itself, steady, enduring, and eternal. Next, we will turn from the collective to the individual, exploring the story of a pharaoh whose life reveals more than monuments or power. It reveals the human thread behind the crown. When we turn from the lives of ordinary Egyptians to the figure of a pharaoh, it is easy to imagine we are entering a world entirely different, a world of gold, grandeur, and divine power. Yet even the rulers of Egypt, exalted as they were, lived within the same cycles of the Nile, the same rhythms of seasons, and the same traditions of ritual that guided every life in the kingdom. To see a pharaoh clearly, one must place him within both the splendor of the palace and the quiet endurance of the land around him. Among the pharaohs of Egypt's long history, Amenhotep III offers a fascinating glimpse into the intersection of wealth, diplomacy, and subtle change. His reign, during the 14th century BCE, is remembered not for dramatic wars or vast conquests, but for a period of unusual peace and prosperity. To speak of him is not to tell a tale of constant battles, but rather of balance, between tradition and innovation, between divine power and earthly presence. Amenhotep III ascended the throne as a young man, inheriting a stable and wealthy kingdom. Egypt at that time controlled rich lands, stretching from Nubia in the south to Syria in the north, with trade routes reaching as far as the Aegean and Mesopotamia. Instead of seeking glory through endless campaigns, Amenhotep devoted himself to strengthening Egypt's image as a land of divine kingship, artistic brilliance, and monumental architecture. Imagine him as he appeared in life, robed in fine linen, adorned with jewelry of gold and semi-precious stones, a ceremonial crook and flail in his hands, symbols of authority. He was presented not only as king, but as a living god, the earthly embodiment of Ra, the sun. In temple reliefs, his features were idealized: broad face, full lips, heavy-lidded eyes that conveyed serenity rather than fierceness. His statues, many of them colossal in scale, were designed to project permanence, as though his image might stand for eternity, unshaken by time. His reign was a golden one, not just in metaphor, but in substance. Gold from Nubia flowed into Egypt, filling treasuries and funding both artistry and diplomacy. Neighboring kingdoms recognized Egypt's wealth and sought alliances, sending princesses in marriage and lavish gifts in exchange for stability and trade. Instead of conquests, Amenhotep ruled through correspondence, his letters preserved in clay tablets known today as the Amarna letters. In them, kings and princes from foreign lands addressed him with respect, acknowledging Egypt as the center of wealth and order. Amenhotep's building projects were vast and deliberate. He commissioned temples, palaces, and statues that dwarfed earlier works. At Thebes, he expanded the great temple of Ammonius, constructing pylons and courts that celebrated both the gods and his own divinity. Perhaps most striking were the colossi of Memnon, two enormous seated statues, each nearly 60 feet tall, that flanked the entrance to his mortuary temple. Even in their ruined state today, they impress with sheer scale, silent guardians of a temple that has long since crumbled. But there were subtler dimensions to his reign as well. Amenhotep cultivated an image of himself not only as a divine ruler, but also as a figure intimately tied to the gods. He associated himself with the sun god Ra, reinforcing the idea that he was the source of light and life on earth. He also fostered the worship of himself as a living deity, encouraging cults in his honor that blurred the line between king and god. For the ordinary people, this was both reassuring and awe-inspiring, a reminder that their pharaoh was not just a leader, but a being of cosmic significance. At his side was Queen Tai, a woman of extraordinary influence. Unlike many queens who remained in the background of official life, Tai was depicted in statues and reliefs alongside her husband, shown as his equal in size and presence. Foreign rulers wrote directly to her, acknowledging her authority. She was more than consort. She was a political partner, advisor, and perhaps one of the first queens in Egyptian history to be truly visible in the affairs of state. Life at Amenhotep's court was one of ceremonial splendor. Imagine the palace at Malkata, a sprawling complex with painted floors depicting fish swimming in pools, birds among reeds, and intricate geometric designs. Courtyards echoed with the sounds of music, harps, flutes, and percussion, while processions of officials, priests, and envoys moved through halls decorated with bright, vivid colors. Meals for the elite were feasts of roasted meats, fruits, breads, and wines imported from abroad, contrasting sharply with the simpler fare of the villages. And yet, for all its grandeur, Amenhotep's reign was not without quiet tensions. By elevating himself so strongly as a god, he shifted the balance between the pharaoh and the traditional priesthood of Ammonius, sowing seeds of conflict that would bear fruit in the reign of his son, Akhenaten. In this subtle tension, we glimpse the complexities beneath the surface of prosperity, a ruler balancing divine image with human politics, prosperity with the weight of tradition. To the outside world, Amenhotep III was a golden king presiding over a kingdom at peace. To his people, he was both ruler and god, visible in festivals and immortalized in statues. His reign was long, nearly 4 decades, and in that time, he left behind not only monuments of stone, but also a legacy of wealth, stability, and subtle transformation. In the stillness of night, one might imagine standing before the colossi of Memnon, gazing up at the immense stone faces that once bore the image of Amenhotep III. Silent, steady, enduring, like the pharaoh himself, a figure whose presence was less about conquest and more about radiance, order, and the eternal rhythm of Egypt. This is the beginning of his story. In the next part, we will move deeper, exploring the intricacies of his reign, the diplomacy that shaped Egypt's place in the world, the artistry that defined an age, and the quiet shadows that would eventually give way to profound religious upheaval. To speak of Amenhotep III's reign is to enter a world where power was exercised not through constant war, but through careful balance. His reign was, above all, a period of diplomacy, of correspondence carried by envoys across deserts and seas, and of gifts exchanged between rulers who understood that Egypt's wealth was unmatched. The clay tablets we now call the Amarna letters provide a rare and quiet window into this era. Written in Akkadian, the diplomatic language of the time, they record kings and princes from Babylon, Assyria, and Mitanni addressing Amenhotep with respectful tones. These rulers often appealed to him as an equal, but their words betray something more. They acknowledged Egypt as the center of stability, a kingdom so secure in its borders that it could extend generosity outward. The letters speak of marriages arranged between foreign princesses and Amenhotep himself. These unions were not matters of romance, but of politics, weaving ties between dynasties and ensuring that Egypt stood at the heart of an intricate network of alliances. Caravans arrived laden with gifts, horses, lapis lazuli, fine textiles, while Egypt, in return, sent gold, the one resource it held in abundance. To neighboring powers, Egypt seemed inexhaustible, a land where gold was as common as dust, as one letter described. This diplomacy was not passive. It required careful management, a sense of when to yield and when to assert. Amenhotep did not campaign ceaselessly into foreign lands, but he kept Egypt's empire intact, sending armies only when necessary to maintain order in Nubia or Syria. His reputation was as powerful as any army. In an age where communication was slow, the idea of Egypt as eternal, rich, and divinely protected was itself a weapon. Artistry flourished under his patronage. Sculptors and painters were encouraged to push beyond rigid tradition, creating works that carried subtle naturalism. Statues of Amenhotep show him with rounded cheeks and soft lines, not only as a god but also as a man at ease. Reliefs depict animals, plants, and scenes of daily life with remarkable detail. Palaces were painted with murals of marshes and gardens, filled with fish, birds, and flowers rendered in bright colors. These images suggest a pharaoh who delighted in beauty, in a vision of life that was full and abundant. Architecture, too, reached extraordinary heights. Amenhotep's mortuary temple, now mostly lost to time, was once among the grandest in Egypt. Its entrance guarded by the colossal statues we now call the Colossi of Memnon. It stretched across a vast area, decorated with reliefs, and statues meant to honor both king and gods. Other temples expanded under his reign, particularly at Luxor, where a great court still bears witness to his building efforts. These projects were not only religious offerings, but also political statements, reminders carved in stone that Egypt's wealth and stability rested in his hands. Yet beneath this surface of grandeur, subtle changes stirred. Amenhotep's emphasis on his own divinity, while continuing a long tradition of pharaohs as gods, became unusually strong. He promoted cults in his own name, commissioning statues and rituals that honored him directly as a living deity. This shift, though not yet a revolution, unsettled the balance between pharaoh and priesthood. The Temple of Ammonius, long the most powerful religious institution in Egypt, saw its influence rivaled by the growing cult of the king himself. His queen, Tai, continued to be central in this period. She appeared in inscriptions, her name written prominently alongside his. Her presence in diplomatic correspondence shows that she was recognized beyond Egypt's borders. When foreign rulers addressed her directly, they acknowledged a reality that Egyptian art itself declared. Tai was no mere consort. She was a political partner whose counsel shaped decisions and whose lineage strengthened her husband's legitimacy. In the private sphere, Amenhotep's court was a place of ceremony, luxury, and ritual. Imagine the palace at Malkata during a festival. The floors painted with lotus blossoms and papyrus swayed under torchlight. Dancers moved in graceful patterns, accompanied by harps and flutes. Servants carried trays of figs, pomegranates, bread, and wine, while foreign envoys looked on, marveling at the abundance. The pharaoh, robed in linen finer than mist, sat in elevated splendor, yet serene, his presence more divine than human. Medicine, astronomy, and writing also advanced under his reign. Priests observed the stars from temple roofs, charting their movements to predict the flooding of the Nile. Physicians compiled remedies, combining practical herbal knowledge with spiritual incantations. Scribes recorded harvests, tributes, and religious texts in careful hieroglyphs. Life at court was not only about wealth, but also about knowledge, sustained by the pharaoh's patronage of learning. In the later years of his reign, however, Amenhotep's health began to decline. Reliefs and statues hint at a heavier figure, and scholars believe he may have suffered from illnesses associated with age and luxury. Still, he continued to project the image of eternal vitality, commissioning statues that depicted him with divine serenity. The contradiction between human frailty and divine kingship was carefully managed, for a pharaoh could not be seen as weak. This gradual decline also brought greater prominence to Queen Tai, who likely assumed increasing responsibilities as her husband's strength waned. Their partnership, visible throughout his reign, became even more pronounced, setting a precedent for powerful queens who followed. To his people, Amenhotep remained a golden figure, a ruler under whose reign Egypt knew peace, wealth, and stability. To history, he is remembered as a king who embodied abundance and radiance, whose reign bridged tradition and transformation. But his insistence on divine kingship, his elevation of his own cult, and his subtle reshaping of religious balance would leave seeds that would grow dramatically in the reign of his son, Akhenaten, a story of radical change that still fascinates the world today. For now, though, we remain with Amenhotep III in a time of gold and order when Egypt stood at its height and the pharaoh's image shone like the sun itself. In the next part, we will look more closely at the closing years of his reign, the legacy he left behind, and the echoes of his choices that shaped Egypt's destiny. The final years of Amenhotep III's reign unfold like a long summer twilight, still bathed in light, but with shadows quietly lengthening. Egypt remained prosperous, its borders stable, its palaces filled with the sound of music and the scent of incense. Yet behind this image of eternal youth and wealth, there are faint signs of transition, reminders that even the most radiant reign must eventually draw to its close. Archaeologists and historians often note that Amenhotep's building projects became even more extravagant in these later years. His mortuary temple on the west bank of Thebes, already vast, was further expanded. The colossal statues that once flanked its entrance, now called the Colossi of Memnon, are all that remains today. These massive stone figures, each more than 60 feet high, stood like guardians at the threshold of eternity. Though damaged by time and earthquakes, they still rise against the desert sky, silent yet commanding, a reminder of how determined Amenhotep was to ensure his memory endured. There's also evidence that the king increasingly associated himself with divine beings, particularly the sun god. Reliefs show him in direct communion with deities, receiving not just their blessing, but their identity. His titles emphasized radiance, glory, and eternal youth, as if he wished to overcome the creeping signs of age by weaving his very name into the fabric of the divine. Scholars debate whether this was simply traditional royal imagery intensified, or whether it reflected deeper shifts in belief that foreshadowed the dramatic religious changes of his son, Akhenaten. Queen Tai, more than ever, took a prominent role in these years. Inscriptions, statues, and surviving correspondence show her depicted almost as an equal partner. Foreign rulers addressed her directly in letters, requesting her intercession in diplomacy. For the people of Egypt, she was a visible presence, a queen whose wisdom and authority balanced the grandeur of her husband. It is no exaggeration to say that Tai redefined the role of royal consort, expanding it beyond ceremonial grace into genuine political influence. But even as the pharaoh sought to project eternal vigor, his health was failing. Statues from his later reign depict a heavier figure, and examinations of his mummy, likely identified among those recovered in the Valley of the Kings, revealed dental problems, joint disease, and signs of physical decline. The man who once ruled like the sun itself may have struggled with pain and weakness in his final years. Yet the official record allowed no such admission. Publicly, he remained radiant, eternally youthful, untroubled by the passage of time. The death of Amenhotep III, around the year 1353 BCE, marked the end of an age often regarded as one of Egypt's high points. His funeral must have been a display of extraordinary scale. Priests recited hymns, processions carried offerings, and the body of the pharaoh was prepared according to the sacred rites that promised eternal life. The tomb, cut into the rock of the Valley of the Kings, was filled with treasures, amulets, and inscriptions designed to guide him through the afterlife. Though much has been lost to robbery and time, the intention was clear. Amenhotep would live forever, both among the gods and in the memory of his people. His reign left behind more than monuments. It set in motion ideas that would ripple across generations. By elevating his own divinity so strongly, Amenhotep blurred the line between pharaoh and god in a way that inspired and perhaps troubled those who followed. His son, Akhenaten, would take this tendency further, attempting to reshape Egyptian religion entirely. Whether Amenhotep foresaw such changes or not, his legacy created the conditions in which they could take root. Yet it is important to remember that to ordinary Egyptians, Amenhotep was not only a divine ruler, but also the king under whom life had been stable, abundant, and secure. Farmers harvested grain under his reign. Artisans carved stone and painted walls. Children were born into a world that felt safe. The memory of peace and prosperity lingered, even as the next chapter of Egypt's history grew more turbulent. After his death, Queen Tai continued to wield influence, particularly during the reign of her son. She served as a bridge between the glorious reign of her husband and the radical vision of her child. This continuity suggests that Amenhotep's presence endured not only in stone and memory, but also through those he left behind. When we stand before the Colossi of Memnon today, gazing up at the weathered stone, we are looking at more than monuments. We are looking at the last echoes of a golden age, at a king who sought to bind himself to eternity. The statues, cracked yet enduring, embody the paradox of his reign: strength and fragility, grandeur and decline, divinity and mortality. In the soft hush of history, Amenhotep III's reign feels like a dream preserved in fragments. A dream of palaces painted with marsh scenes, of banquets filled with song, of letters sent across deserts bearing gifts of gold, of a queen standing steadfast beside her king, and of a ruler who sought to shine as the sun itself. His story, though often overshadowed by the dramatic upheavals that followed, remains a quiet marvel. A reminder that sometimes the most extraordinary power lies not in conquest, but in stability, beauty, and the calm assurance of order. With this, we close the chapter on Amenhotep III. Ahead lies the shadow of Akhenaten, whose radical vision would challenge tradition and reshape Egypt's path. But for now, let us rest with the memory of a pharaoh who embodied the abundance of his age, whose monuments still rise from the desert, silent and timeless, watching over the Nile. When we step away from the well-lit halls of palaces and temples and wander instead into the half-light of the unknown, we find ourselves surrounded by mysteries. Ancient Egypt is not merely a civilization of records and monuments. It is a world that leaves questions suspended in silence, as if the sands themselves wish to keep certain truths hidden. And so, for every inscription carefully carved, there are gaps in the story, pieces missing, riddles unsolved. Consider the colossi of Memnon, those silent stone guardians from Amenhotep III's mortuary temple. For centuries after their construction, travelers reported something strange. At dawn, when the air was cool and the desert was touched by the first rays of sunlight, one of the colossi was said to sing. A faint, melodic hum, like a voice rising from the stone itself, greeted the morning. Greeks and Romans journeyed long distances to witness this wonder. Some believed it was the statue calling to the sun god, others that it was the voice of Memnon, a hero from their own mythology, who had died in the Trojan War and whose soul now lingered in Egyptian stone. Modern science offers a different explanation. The sound may have come from the rapid heating of the stone, creating vibrations as the blocks expanded with the morning warmth. Yet even if the cause was natural, the effect was powerful. To those who stood in the cool desert air and heard the voice of a monument, it was a reminder that stone, too, could breathe and sing. What strikes us today is not only the mystery itself, but the human response. The blending of cultures, the weaving together of myth and experience across centuries. Another enigma lies beneath the sands, quite literally. Egypt is filled with structures that remain unexcavated or only partly understood. Beneath the temple complexes, archaeologists have discovered tunnels and chambers whose purposes are not fully known. Some may have been storage spaces, others, ritual passages meant to guide priests in sacred ceremonies. The Great Pyramid itself still holds mysteries. Though studied for centuries, it continues to reveal surprises. Hidden voids detected by modern scanning technology, spaces whose function remains uncertain. Were they structural, meant to relieve pressure on the massive stones above? Or were they symbolic, designed for rituals we can no longer reconstruct? The Valley of the Kings, where Amenhotep III and so many others were buried, is another source of enduring riddles. Tombs still lie undiscovered, waiting beneath the cliffs. Archaeologists suspect that some royals remain hidden, their final resting places carefully concealed to protect them from ancient thieves. There are also questions about tombs already known. Why do some chambers remain undecorated, as if abandoned in haste? Why do some sarcophagi appear reused, perhaps originally meant for someone else? Each incomplete carving, each empty corridor, whispers of decisions made long ago, decisions whose reasons are lost to time. And then there is the mystery of knowledge itself. How did Egyptian engineers raise obelisks weighing hundreds of tons? How did they transport colossal statues across miles of desert? Theories abound. Sledges dragged over sand, lubricated with water, teams of workers coordinating in perfect rhythm. Recent experiments suggest that these methods are possible. Yet when one stands before a massive block of granite, quarried far from the Nile, and somehow transported with precision, the accomplishment still feels almost miraculous. Even in daily life, small mysteries endure. The exact recipes for certain pigments used in wall paintings, the full symbolic meaning of particular rituals, the private prayers whispered in homes. All these remain largely unknown. Archaeology recovers fragments, but the texture of lived experience often slips through our fingers. Perhaps that is part of the gentle allure of Egyptian history. It is a civilization both documented and elusive, both solid as stone and fragile as memory. It is worth remembering that many mysteries remain not because the Egyptians failed to record them, but because time itself is a thief. Scrolls written on fragile papyrus disintegrated. Wooden objects crumbled. Temples were dismantled. Statues eroded. Names deliberately erased. What we see today is only a portion of what once was the survivors of millennia of change. And so, the absence of answers is itself part of the story, reminding us that history is always incomplete. For those listening tonight, drifting in the borderland between wakefulness and sleep, these mysteries can be thought of not as puzzles to be solved, but as gentle companions. Let the idea of a statue that sings in the dawn accompany you. Imagine the cool corridors of a hidden tomb, silent and waiting beneath the earth. Picture the slow, steady motion of workers pulling ropes, inch by inch, as a massive obelisk rises against the sky. These images, half seen and half known, are like dreams, shapes that suggest much, yet never resolve completely. Mystery, after all, is part of rest. Just as not every dream must be explained, not every riddle of the past requires a solution. Sometimes it is enough to let the unknown remain unknown, to allow the sands to hold their secrets. In this way, Egypt itself becomes like a lullaby, repetitive in its rhythm, soothing in its patterns, and filled with quiet spaces where imagination can wander. The sands of Egypt do not only conceal monuments and treasures. They hold stories interrupted mid-sentence, chapters torn from a scroll of time. Some of the most fascinating enigmas are not those we see, but those we can only imagine. The absence of clarity leaves space for gentle wonder, and in the hush of night, such mysteries unfold like whispers carried by desert wind. One enduring puzzle lies with lost tombs. Archaeologists have long believed that the burial places of certain pharaohs remain undiscovered. Queen Nefertiti, the powerful consort of Akhenaten, has no known tomb, though her presence lingers everywhere in art and legend. For decades, researchers have speculated that her resting place lies hidden within the Valley of the Kings, perhaps concealed behind a false wall in Tutankhamun's own tomb. Scans and studies hint at voids, but the sands and the silence refuse to yield certainty. The mystery persists, an unfinished lullaby, softly humming at the edge of knowledge. Then there are pharaohs erased deliberately. In Egypt, memory was power. To remove a name from inscriptions was to deny someone eternity. Hatshepsut, the woman who ruled as king, had her monuments defaced after her death. Akhenaten, the heretic king who razed temples to Aten, was likewise erased. Yet their traces endure. Fragments of their statues survive. Their names re-emerge in neglected corners of temples. What compels reflection is not only the erasure itself, but the irony. Attempts to obliterate memory often preserve curiosity. In being forbidden, their stories become irresistible, still recounted thousands of years later. Among the enigmas of practice, mummification offers quiet puzzles. The process was both technical and spiritual, yet much remains unclear. Why did methods shift over time, from highly skilled preservation in the New Kingdom to more careless embalming in later periods? Why were some animals, cats, ibises, crocodiles, mummified in staggering numbers, sometimes in mass burials? Were these offerings of devotion, or part of a vast temple economy where pilgrims purchased sacred animals as votive gifts? Archaeologists uncover bundles of linen, tiny skeletal remains, traces of resins, but the motivations remain hazy. half lit by ritual and belief. Even objects raise questions. Consider the shabby figurines, small carved servants buried with the dead. They were meant to labor in the afterlife on behalf of the deceased. Yet the numbers vary wildly. Some burials have a handful, others contain hundreds. Why such disparity? Was it a matter of wealth or evolving theological ideas? A row of shabtis, identical and silent, can feel almost eerie, as if ready to awaken at a command that will never come. Another mystery surrounds sound and light. Certain temples were built with acoustic qualities that magnify chants or echoes. In Karnak, whispers can travel strangely, as if guided by stone. At Abu Simbel, the rising sun penetrates the sanctuary on specific days of the year, illuminating statues of the gods seated within. Was this careful astronomy, or coincidence elevated into sacred meaning? Perhaps both. In the stillness of night, such alignments feel less like engineering and more like magic written in stone. The enigma of labor also endures. The pyramids, long imagined as the toil of slaves, are now understood as the work of skilled laborers, organized crews who live in nearby villages. Archaeologists have found bakeries, breweries, and barracks that sustain these workers. Yet how do they synchronize such immense projects? How many thousands of hands moved in harmony, hauling blocks, carving inscriptions, painting walls? The answers are partial at best, the rhythm of their effort now silent. Still, one can almost hear the distant echoes, the scrape of stone, the chant of overseers, the thud of wood sledges pressed into wet sand. And then there are mysteries that border on myth. Tales of hidden chambers beneath the Sphinx persist, though excavations remain inconclusive. Ancient writers spoke of libraries buried deep underground, holding lost wisdom of the gods. To modern ears, such claims may sound like fantasy, yet they remind us of something essential. Egypt inspired wonder even in antiquity. To Greeks, Romans, and travelers from distant lands, the monuments seemed eternal, already ancient, already unfathomable. That sense of mystery was not invented by modern imagination. It is woven into Egypt's identity. For the weary mind listening now, perhaps the true comfort lies in the fact that mysteries endure it all. Knowledge does not erase them, it reshapes them. Every answer opens new questions. Every discovery reveals more unknowns. The story of Egypt is not fixed. It shifts like sand, flowing around what we cannot yet grasp. And so, imagine yourself drifting through these enigmas as though through dreams. A sealed doorway, painted with fading hieroglyphs, never opened. A statue's name carved away, leaving a scar in the stone. A chamber filled with tiny figurines, waiting in eternal silence. These are not puzzles demanding solutions tonight. They are gentle companions for rest. Let them linger at the edge of thought, fading slowly until they blend with sleep itself. The further we wander into Egypt's enigmas, the more we begin to realize that mystery is not something to be solved, but something to be lived with like the hush of night itself. The pharaohs may have commanded armies and raised monuments, but they could not control what time would conceal. Their civilization spoke in stone and ritual, yet so much remains unsaid, leaving us with silences that hum like distant echoes. One of the greatest mysteries is time itself. The Egyptian timeline spans over 3,000 years, longer than the history of Rome and Greece combined. Within this immense stretch, dynasties rose and fell, yet many rulers are barely more than names. Lists carved on temple walls, such as the king list at Abydos, selectively remember some kings while omitting others. Why were certain reigns honored while others erased? The answer is uncertain, but the omissions are striking. Whole lives, whole decades, pass by as shadows between brighter torches, to lie down at night and think of centuries dissolving into dust is to feel the immensity of time pressing gently upon the imagination. Even the monuments we think we know conceal enigmas. The pyramids, so familiar in silhouette, still hold puzzles. Small shafts within the Great Pyramid lead nowhere, or perhaps to chambers never reached. Robotic cameras have peeked inside, revealing sealed doors untouched for millennia. What lies beyond? Gold, ritual objects, or nothing at all? Sometimes the answer is less important than the act of wondering. In the quiet of night, the image of a sealed stone corridor stretching into darkness is more dream than fact, something to drift upon like a slow current. The Sphinx, too, guards its secrets. Its body has been buried and uncovered by sand multiple times across history. Erosion marks raised debates. Was it carved in the Old Kingdom, or even earlier, from a time before the dynasties began? No inscription explains its origin. Legends say it watches over hidden chambers, or marks an entrance to forgotten halls. Yet the truth remains veiled, as though the monument itself prefers silence. Other enigmas are smaller, quieter. Certain tombs contain rooms with no clear function. Were they storage, ritual spaces, or symbolic passages for the soul? Some sarcophagi are too large to have been moved through their doorways, leading to speculation they were placed before the tomb was sealed forever. Objects such as the mysterious dendrolite, carving, or strange symbolic devices stir theories, but perhaps these were metaphors misunderstood through distance of time. Even the written word leaves riddles. Hieroglyphs are not simply pictures, but layers of meaning, sounds, ideas, and symbols interwoven. Scholars decode them, yet some words resist translation. Certain religious texts remain ambiguous, as though they were never meant to be fixed in meaning. They function like poetry, multiple truths existing side by side. Imagine a priest chanting words by torchlight in a darkened chamber, their meaning partly hidden even to listeners of their own age. That obscurity itself becomes part of the sacred atmosphere, beyond artifacts and words. Egypt holds mysteries of the human spirit. Why did people devote such effort to eternity? Why labor decades to build a tomb that would never be seen by the living? Why preserve the body at such cost, filling it with resins, oils, and wrappings? To modernize, it may seem excessive, yet for them, it was as natural as planting crops. To live was to prepare for death. To die was to continue living in another form. This vision, half understood by us, remains suspended between clarity and enigma. And perhaps the greatest mystery of all is how Egypt still captivates. Across thousands of years, across cultures and languages, the allure remains unbroken. Ancient travelers carved their names upon monuments. Medieval scribes told tales of hidden wisdom. Modern tourists walk among ruins with awe. The fascination endures not because everything is known, but because so much is not. Egypt whispers across time, not in answers but in riddles, each one drawing us closer. For the listener, now drifting towards sleep, these enigmas do not demand thought. They ask only to be felt. A sealed tomb, waiting. A forgotten name, erased yet lingering. A statue staring across desert sands. These are not puzzles to strain the mind, but lullabies for the imagination. As you close your eyes, picture yourself wandering a quiet temple lit by moonlight, its hieroglyphs fading, its echoes long and soft. The mystery is not a problem. It is a companion, walking beside you into the realm of dreams. And so, we leave this segment not with answers, but with stillness. The mysteries of Egypt remain where they belong, in the hush of stone, in the flowing of the Nile, in the imagination of those who drift gently into sleep while thinking of them. When we think of ancient Egypt, it is tempting to imagine only the splendor. Golden masks, carved obelisks, grand temples gleaming in the desert sun. Yet the truth of Egypt is a study in contrast. For every pharaoh reclining in luxury, there were thousands of laborers bending beneath the weight of stone. For every court feast filled with honey cakes and wine, there were households where bread was scarce and barley beer the only comfort. To drift deeper into the story of this civilization is to observe the rhythm of its inequalities, the vast gulf between the ruling few and the working many. At the top of this society stood the pharaoh, believed to be a living god, the axis around which all life revolved. His existence was wrapped in ritual and abundance. He dined upon the finest foods: roasted goose, fresh figs, sweet honey, and wines imported from distant lands. His clothing was woven from linen of the finest weave, soft and near translucent, adorned with jewelry of lapis lazuli, carnelian, and gold. He was sheltered in palaces with cool courtyards, pools shaded by date palms, and floors inlaid with painted lotus patterns. For the pharaoh, the desert's harshness was softened, its toil hidden behind walls of privilege. Yet beyond those palace gates, life was very different. The common farmer rose with the sun to tend his fields, guided by the flooding of the Nile. His home was a small mud-brick dwelling, its walls whitewashed, its roof flat and used for sleeping on hot nights. Meals were simple: bread made from emmer wheat, coarse and sometimes gritty with bits of stone from the grinding process, and a daily ration of beer, thick and nourishing. Meat was rare, often reserved for festivals. Instead, lentils, onions, and cucumbers filled the diet, along with dates and figs when available. These were meals of sustenance, not luxury. The pharaoh's servants and courtiers lived in a world that straddled both spheres. They enjoyed privileges, but remained always dependent upon royal favor. A nobleman might have a fine house with painted walls and gardens, yet his fortune was tethered to the court's shifting politics. One day he might preside over grand ceremonies. Another, he could find himself disgraced and forgotten. The stability of rank was never entirely secure, though from the outside, his life appeared golden. The workers who built monuments for kings lived in conditions shaped by their labor. In the village of Deir el-Medina, artisans who carved the royal tombs were provided with housing, wages, and rations. They recorded complaints when supplies of bread or oil fell short, leaving a surprisingly human record of everyday struggle. Though these workers were more privileged than peasants in the fields, their lives still carried hardship, their backs bent under the demands of endless construction. They left graffiti in the tombs they built, lines that blur the distance between ordinary man and divine king. The contrast extended even into death. For the pharaoh, death was a passage marked by elaborate rituals, pyramids, or richly decorated tombs, and a body preserved with care so that the soul might recognize it in eternity. Nobles, too, had tombs adorned with painted walls, scenes of banquets, and offerings designed to sustain them forever. But for the vast majority, burial was simple. A shallow grave, perhaps lined with matting, a body wrapped in linen if the family could afford it. The desert sands themselves often preserve the dead, though not with the grandeur of kings. The afterlife was promised to all, yet the pathways into it were unequal. Religion itself reflected these contrasts, though it also softened them. While the pharaoh communed with the gods in temples closed to ordinary eyes, even the humblest laborer could whisper prayers at a household shrine or leave offerings at a wayside chapel. A farmer might pray for rain or protection for his cattle, his words carrying no less sincerity than the hymns sung in Karnak. The divine, in this sense, belonged both to the mighty and the meek. Yet, despite such an equality, Egyptian society was not static. Scribes, those who mastered the art of writing, could rise above humble origins, earning posts in administration. Soldiers who distinguished themselves could win rewards of land. Women, too, in contrast with some later societies, enjoyed rights to property, inheritance, and divorce. Though most remained bound to their stations, the possibility of mobility shimmered faintly, like the glimmer of the Nile under starlight. The contrast, then, is not only of wealth, but of experience. To walk the streets of an Egyptian city would mean passing grand villas and modest huts side by side. To stand in a marketplace was to hear noblemen's servants bargaining for luxuries, while farmers traded onions for bread. The society was a mosaic, some tiles gleaming with gold, others rough and worn, all contributing to the picture of civilization that endured for millennia. And for us, listening in the quiet of night, These contrasts create a slow, steady rhythm. Luxuries and hardships, palaces and fields, golden masks and simple bread. One cannot exist without the other. It is the interplay of splendor and simplicity that makes Egypt's story enduring, that makes it as soothing as the Nile's unending flow. As you sink deeper into calm, imagine standing at the riverbank at dusk. Across the water, the silhouettes of grand temples rise, while in the foreground, farmers guide oxen through furrows. Both belong to the same world. Both are Egypt. To drift deeper into the contrast between the privileged few and the ordinary many, let us step quietly inside the homes of Egypt's elites, those whose lives were cushioned with wealth and influence. Their dwellings were not merely shelters, but reflections of power. Large villas stood behind high walls, with symmetrical gardens carefully watered through channels drawn from the Nile. Shade trees, pomegranate orchards, and pools filled with lotus blossoms brought coolness into the heart of the desert. The air within such gardens was heavy with perfume from imported oils, a world away from the dust of the streets outside. Within these houses, floors were often painted to resemble carpets of reeds, birds, and flowers. Walls gleamed with painted scenes, servants carrying trays of fruit, musicians playing harps, and offerings to the gods. The wealthy dined not on coarse bread and onions, but on freshly baked loaves dusted with sesame, on fish grilled with herbs, on roasted ducks and geese. Honey, figs, and dates were staples, and imported delicacies, such as wine from the Levant, were prized. The feast table was not only for nourishment, but for spectacle, a demonstration of status before guests. At these banquets, music filled the air. Harps, flutes, and tambourines accompanied dancers who moved gracefully in candlelight. Servants poured wine into golden cups, while perfumes were sprinkled on guests to refresh them. Men and women wore fine linen garments bleached white, their hair adorned with fragrant cones of fat that slowly melted, releasing perfume. Jewelry glinted at wrists and necks, delicate amulets alongside bold golden collars. These were moments of refinement, curated to display the abundance granted by privilege. Yet alongside luxury came responsibility, or at least the appearance of it. Nobles served as administrators, overseeing landholdings and collecting taxes for the state. They were judges, generals, priests, scribes of high rank, positions that kept the machinery of Egypt turning. Still, politics was as precarious as it was powerful. A noble too ambitious might fall from favor, his fortune vanishing overnight. The pharaoh's smile could elevate a family. His displeasure could cast them into ruin. While the elites gathered in lavish feasts, ordinary households wrestled with scarcity. Their meals were repetitive and plain. Bread that wore down teeth from the grit of grinding stones. Beer thick enough to serve as food, onions and legumes to fill the belly. A handful of dates might sweeten the day, but luxuries were beyond reach. Where nobles adorned themselves with linen and jewelry, commoners wore rougher weaves, often patched, their adornments simple beads of clay or faience. Where nobles relaxed in shaded courtyards, laborers sweated under the sun, mending canals, tending crops, hauling stone. Even in leisure, the contrast was clear. The wealthy enjoyed music, board games such as Senet, and leisurely hunts in marshlands, their boats gliding across lotus-covered waters as attendants set nets for birds. The common man's recreation was simpler. Songs sung during work, stories told at evening gatherings, simple toys carved for children. Yet within these modest joys, there was resilience, the kind of quiet endurance that held society together far more than feasts or jewels. Inside noble households, women managed estates, oversaw servants, and participated in religious life. Wealthy women could own property, inherit land, and even conduct business. Their presence was visible in tomb art, seated beside husbands at banquets, or shown enjoying offerings in eternity. By contrast, the lives of ordinary women were filled with constant labor, grinding grain, baking bread, weaving linen, carrying water from the river. Their work was ceaseless and essential, though seldom celebrated. Education formed another line of division. The sons of nobles studied to become scribes, their hands trained to write elegant hieroglyphs on papyrus. Knowledge of writing opened doors to administration, temples, and royal courts. For common families, such learning was rare. Most were illiterate, their knowledge practical. How to farm, how to build, how to survive. Yet both noble and commoner shared in stories, in oral traditions that carried myths, proverbs, and wisdom across generations. In this, memory served as the great equalizer, allowing even the poorest to inherit Egypt's cultural wealth. In religion, too, the divide was both clear and blurred. The wealthy commissioned priests to perform elaborate rituals, paid for offerings to ensure divine favor, and secured tombs adorned with texts to guide them through the afterlife. Ordinary folk, lacking resources for such grandeur, relied on simpler shrines, an amulet for protection, a prayer whispered by a doorway, a small offering at a local temple. Yet belief in gods, in the cycle of death and rebirth, belonged equally to all. The elite could surround themselves with painted guides, but the heart of devotion beat as strongly in the humblest household. Seen together, these contrasts paint a society of immense disparity but also shared humanity. The noble feasts glowed with splendor, but the taste of bread linked king and farmer alike. The jewelry of the wealthy dazzled, but both rich and poor gazed upon the same stars above the desert. For those now drifting toward rest, this rhythm of difference and sameness is soothing. As you listen, imagine yourself moving through an ancient Egyptian town at twilight. You pass a noble villa where music drifts into the air, laughter spilling into the night. A little farther, you hear the crackle of a hearth in a mud brick home, where a family shares bread and beer before sleep. Two worlds, side by side, separate yet connected, both part of Egypt's endless story. Beyond the noble villas and the humble homes of laborers, another layer of Egyptian life thrived. Workers and artisans whose skill gave shape to the monuments that still rise from the sands. These were the men and women who carved statues, painted tomb walls, chiseled hieroglyphs, and raised pyramids stone by stone. Their work was both practical and sacred, a blending of labor and devotion that left imprints lasting far beyond their lifetimes. Artisans lived in communities such as Deir el-Medina, a village built for the workers who crafted the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. Unlike the scattered huts of peasants, this settlement had planned streets, walls of uniform height, and a rhythm of life centered on artistry. Here, skilled hands painted scenes of gods and stars on plaster, cut burial chambers deep into cliffs, and inscribed texts that promised eternal life for kings. These workers, though not wealthy, held a special place in society. Their craft connected them directly to the divine. Daily routines were strict. Workmen were assigned tasks and kept records of their hours, surprisingly detailed by the standards of the ancient world. If someone was absent, the reason was written down, whether illness, attending to a wife, or brewing beer. Even artisans, though closer to the gods through their craft, faced the same human realities of fatigue, quarrels, and hunger. They ate simple meals of bread, beer, and vegetables, much like other commoners, though occasionally their rations included meat as reward for their service. Alongside them, laborers hauled stone, mended canals, and carried baskets of earth. Their strength fueled the ambitions of kings, but their names often faded into silence. A grand temple might bear the image of a pharaoh offering gifts to the gods, yet nowhere mention the thousands who lifted its walls into being. Still, the calluses on their hands were part of Egypt's greatness. Their labor was invisible yet indispensable. In this world, gender roles shaped experience. Men worked in fields, building sites, and workshops. Women maintained households, ground grain, brewed beer, and raised children. Yet women were not powerless. Egyptian society offered them more independence than many other ancient cultures. Women could own land, inherit property, and even appear in court as legal equals. In noble families, Women sometimes wielded immense influence, acting as priestesses or, in rare cases, as rulers themselves. But among ordinary folk, survival required everyone's effort. The distinction between male and female labor blurred when work pressed hard enough. Burial practices further revealed contrast. The wealthy commissioned elaborate tombs, stocked with goods, jewelry, and texts to secure a blessed afterlife. Tomb walls showed banquets, offerings, and eternal feasts awaiting the departed. Commoners, lacking such resources, were buried in simple graves, often wrapped in reed mats or rough cloth. Their offerings were modest: a jug of beer, a few loaves of bread, perhaps a small amulet for protection. Yet in both cases, rich or poor, the belief remained that life continued beyond death. The same sun that rose each morning promised rebirth, and in this belief all were united. The artisans of Deir el-Medina sometimes left traces of their own voices, graffiti etched onto tomb walls, sketches on shards of pottery, glimpses of humor and humanity in otherwise solemn places. One might find a playful drawing of a cat playing a harp or a donkey dressed as a nobleman. These light-hearted touches remind us that behind the labor, behind the grand facades, were ordinary people with laughter, frustrations, and imaginations not so different from ours. In reflecting on these contrasts, noble feasts, peasant toil, artisan craft, women's work, and burial customs, we find both separation and connection. The gaps between wealth and poverty, privilege and labor, glitter and dust were real and often harsh. Yet Egypt's unity rested on something shared, a belief in order in Ma'at, the principle of balance and harmony that guided the cosmos. Whether noble or farmer, artisan or servant, all were bound together by the Nile, by the gods, by the rhythms of life and death. And so, as you drift deeper into rest, imagine standing at the edge of the Nile at twilight. On one side of the river, noble villas glow with torches, music drifting into the warm air. On the other side, fields stretch into darkness, where farmers finish their work and families gather around small hearths. Beyond both, in the distance, the silhouettes of tombs lie quiet beneath the cliffs, where artisans carve passages into stone for kings who dreamed of eternity. In this single moment, all strands of Egyptian life come together. The rich, the poor, the workers, the women, the departed, all part of a vast and ancient whole. The story of Egypt is not only the story of pharaohs and monuments. It is also the story of those who lived in mud brick houses, who carved figures by lamplight, who ground grain into flour, who whispered prayers to unseen gods. It is the story of humanity itself, stretched across centuries, held together by the gentle current of the Nile. And so, our quiet walk through the age of the pharaohs comes to its end. We have wandered through their homes and temples, listened to the faint echoes of their prayers, and traced the long shadows cast by pyramids at dusk. The sand have carried us past moments of triumph, of mystery, and of simple daily life, reminding us that history is not only found in monuments, but also in the rhythm of ordinary days. As you settle into the stillness of the present, notice the difference. The world around you now is gentler, warmer, more secure. You need not toil beneath a heavy sun, or worry about the flooding of the Nile, or the demands of a distant ruler. You need only breathe. The stories of the past remain far away, like distant stars in the sky, beautiful to imagine, but no longer pressing upon you. The pyramids endure, vast and unchanging. But here in your room, you are safe, soft in your bed, surrounded by the small comforts of modern life. A blanket, a pillow, the familiar hum of quietness. While those who lived by the Nile once gazed into the night, hoping for peace and rest beyond, you may find that peace here and now in the simple gift of sleep. So let go of the images of stone and sand. Allow them to drift into the distance, like faint lanterns carried downstream. Let your breathing grow slower, like the timeless rhythm of the river. Know that the past is behind you, secure in its silence, while the present holds you gently. Rest now. Drift in a sleep as the desert sleeps. Let the pyramids keep their watch in the distance, while you enter the deep, calm night of your own dreams.